Joe Cross, sheriff of Eddington, New Mexico, is on patrol late at night. During a break, he watches a YouTube video titled, "How to Talk to Your Partner About Starting a Family When They're Not Ready." Soon after, another car pulls up. The officers tell Joe to put on a mask, saying he's in Belleau village territory, not Eddington. Joe insists he's still within town limits, but they explain he crossed the border and must follow CO rules. Reluctantly, Joe complies. Moments later, his deputy Micheal radios in about a man causing trouble at the mayor's bar. At the bar, Mayor Ted Garcia is in a meeting. He tells Joe a homeless man is blocking the entrance. Joe reminds him the bar isn't his office and the man is a paying customer. The man forces his way in, fights Joe, then flees. Outside, Ted's son Eric films everything for Instagram. That night at home, Joe shuts off a conspiracy video about CO playing on his mother-in-law's laptop before Dawn wakes up. He brings flowers to his wife, Louise, who notices his limp. Joe brushes it off, saying it was just a scuffle at the bar. He compliments her handmade dolls. She says someone bought 2. He casually asks if she still plans to move out in April. Louise replies she can't, not while the pandemic continues. Joe kisses her, but she stops him. He reassures her not to apologize. The next morning, Dawn rants about a 2018 pandemic drill called Clay X, claiming the current crisis is just corruption. She also scolds Joe for going to Ted's bar. On his way to work, Joe sees a man denied entry into a store for not wearing a mask. Claiming he also has asthma, Joe removes his mask and joins him in line. Inside, the man is forced out again. Joe defends him until Ted arrives and insists the rules are governor-mandated. Joe argues they aren't enforceable. After paying for the man's groceries, Joe is tagged on Facebook, sparking an idea: run for mayor. He records an intro video, criticizing mask mandates and promising to serve Eddington as he has as sheriff for 7 years. At the station, his deputies are stunned but agree to help with campaign slogans and graphics. Joe even asks Guy to have friends buy Louise's dolls to boost her sales. Later, Ted calls him outside, apologizes for their earlier conflict, but Joe stands firm about running. Ted accuses him of seeking revenge, but Joe replies, "Let the people decide." At a council meeting, Laura warns Ted that a new data center will drain water and damage the environment. His advisor, Warren, calms him and hands over documents to sign. Warren hints at targeting Joe's unstable wife, but Ted refuses, though he admits he once briefly dated her decades ago. Warren then gives him a pocket watch from the governor. Ted notices Eric leaving with the car. Eric says he's meeting his friend Brian. Ted warns him to follow CO protocols. When Eric reminds him it's his mother's birthday, Ted ignores it. Meanwhile, Joe watches one of Ted's campaign videos, scoffing at his promises. Micheal notes that Ted is Hispanic, surprising Joe. Later, the deputies brainstorm slogans and learn Paula, a council member, consistently opposes Ted. She explains the data center is on Pueblo, Eddington land and is an AI deep learning project pushed by the governor. That night, Eric and friends hang out at the beach. Brian, crushing on Sarah, asks for advice. Eric tells him to relax but is soon seen talking closely with Sarah himself. Brian's hopes sink when told Sarah only uses Eric to make her ex jealous. Later, Eric mocks Brian during a conversation about privilege. Back at the station, Micheal sees Sarah's Instagram and Joe considers promoting him to sergeant. Micheal is thrilled, saying he'd be younger than his father was. Joe reminds him everyone climbs step by step. That night, Joe finds Louise's laptop looping his campaign video. Switching tabs, he discovers a site by Vernon, who supports SA victims. The next morning, Louise and Dawn return home. Louise refuses to speak. Joe apologizes from outside the window, saying he should have consulted her. She worries public scrutiny will expose her, but Joe promises to protect her. Louise says she wants no part in his feud with Ted. Joe calms her, invites her to dinner, and she agrees. He resumes campaigning, attacking Ted as a puppet for the governor and criticizing the controversial data center. Eric mocks him, saying to also reveal how his dad dumped his wife. Later, Joe orders a group of teens protesting police violence to disperse. Sarah confronts Micheal, urging him to join them, but he stays silent. At the station, Joe learns about George Floyd's death and realizes why the protests erupted. He scolds Micheal for not telling him. Guy warns unrest is spreading, but Joe insists it's not an issue locally. Meanwhile, Sarah pushes Brian and others toward radical anti-whiteness ideology, shocking his parents. That night, Joe prepares a romantic dinner for Louise. Hours later, she comes home, accompanied by Vernon and two strangers. Vernon introduces himself along with a married couple named Nicolette and Will. They praise Louise's work, saying, "This is incredible. All of this is Lou. God is speaking through you." Then Vernon notices a photo of Louise's father. Dawn explains that her husband, who was once the town sheriff, died 7 years ago from a heart attack. Vernon recalls that when his own father died, his mind felt as though it had completely reset. Curious, Louise asks him to explain further. Vernon reveals that his father was a government employee, and when he was a child, he was given away to his father's colleagues. Along with 10 other children, he was released into the woods and hunted down like animals. The story sounds far-fetched to Joe, who asks how Vernon managed to escape. Calmly, Vernon replies, "You want everything neat, Joe. But that's not how life works." He goes on to explain that one of his captors fell in love with him and released him, but later died, and eventually his father took his own life. Louise expresses her disgust at a society that allows predators to roam free. She points out that many children live in fear, believing their experiences are rare and isolated. Suddenly, Dawn yells at Louise to stop talking and storms out of the room. Shortly after, Vernon takes his leave. The next morning, he then receives a call from Guy, warning that the protests are spiraling out of control. Paula suggests canceling the upcoming town council meeting, but Joe insists that nothing bad will happen. At the station, Joe reprimands his deputies for failing to manage the protesters. Micheal explains that the demonstrators are deliberately provoking the police to capture incidents on video and spread them online to make law enforcement look bad. Later, Joe and his deputies attempt to move teenagers off the road for their safety, but they refuse to comply. When Joe notices Eric holding a protest sign, he rebukes him, saying his father should be punished for what he did to his wife. Eric fires back by insulting Louise, which prompts Joe to shove him. Meanwhile, Sarah confronts Micheal, urging him to join the protest against racist cops. She shouts that he must have experienced racism himself and should be out on the streets, not her. Eventually, Joe calms the crowd by asking them to sit for 8 minutes. He tells them that if they are against violence, they shouldn't be creating it themselves. Afterwards, Joe enters Paula's shop and begins recording his statement. He claims that there is no freedom in Eddington and that violence is slowly corroding the town. Joe blames Ted's leadership, calling him a monster who impregnated his wife when she was just 16 and forced her to have an abortion. Joe admits this might be hard to believe given Ted's charming facade, but he also points out the mysterious absence of Ted's wife, hinting Ted may be responsible. He ends his speech by declaring that he can protect the town better. Meanwhile, Eric sends Brian a photo of himself kissing Sarah at his house. Out of jealousy, Brian forwards it to Micheal. That night, Joe returns home to find Louise outside with her bags packed. He apologizes, but she ignores him and leaves with Vernon. Inside, Dawn, who often criticizes Joe, admits she is proud of him for finally speaking the truth. The next morning, Joe opens his phone and finds a video from Louise. She denies ever being abused by Ted, claiming it was a lie invented by her mother and kept alive by Joe. Louise admits she was abused by someone else but refuses to reveal the name. Joe then receives a call from Guy about a noise complaint at the mayor's house. Joe goes to Ted's home and turns off the music, but Ted defiantly turns it back on and slaps Joe. Humiliated, Joe leaves and vents his frustration at a bar. There, he finds a homeless man stealing drinks. Joe snaps and shoots him. He bags the corpse and dumps it into the river. At home, Ted relaxes on the couch watching TV. He notices a girl's purse on the table and scolds Eric for bringing a girl into the house. Suddenly, a gunshot rings out. Ted is killed, followed by Eric. The shooter is revealed to be Joe. He retrieves the shell casing and enters the house, taking the watch Ted had received from the governor. Afterwards, Joe tries calling his wife, but she doesn't answer. Joe heads into the city to test for carbon monoxide poisoning, fearing the homeless man might have carried it. Soon after, Guy calls to inform him about Ted's murder. Joe arrives at the crime scene and notices Brian nearby. He also meets the woman who discovered Ted's body after her dog wandered inside. She explains she called Pueblo County Police because the back house falls under their jurisdiction. Annoyed, Joe goes inside. Detective Butterfly from Pueblo County shows him a 5.56 shell casing that was found. Joe curtly tells him to put it on the counter. They discover a purse that turns out to belong to Sarah. After informing her of Eric's death, Joe questions her. Guy points out that her social media is filled with posts encouraging protests and riots. Sarah denies the accusations, suggesting it may actually be their opponents spreading misinformation. Later, Joe holds a press conference, vowing to capture the killer and claiming evidence points to Antifa terrorists. That night, Joe watches his wedding video. The following morning, Dawn tells him her daughter isn't answering calls and that Vernon has blocked her. Joe admits Louise isn't answering his calls either. He recalls their conversation about how she had urged Louise to research Vernon, believing he might help her. When Joe arrives at the station, he finds Brian in the interrogation room. Brian admits that out of jealousy, he sent the photo of Sarah to Micheal. The next day, he went to Eric's house to look for her but fled when he saw the police. Guy suspects Micheal may have killed Ted so that once Joe became mayor, he could help Micheal become sheriff. Joe checks Michael's phone and finds the photo. Micheal insists Sarah doesn't mean much to him. But Guy then reports that a rifle was found in Michael's car. Micheal defends himself, saying Joe knows he takes the gun out for target practice and urges them to conduct a ballistic test. Joe orders the car to be searched. Inside, they find Ted's watch, and Micheal is immediately arrested. Micheal pleads his innocence. Meanwhile, Detective Butterfly notices handwriting that matches evidence found at Ted's crime scene. He rushes out, with Joe chasing after him. At Joe's house, security footage shows Dawn pleading with officers to find her daughter. But the detective instead asks if there are any guns in the house. Guy calls Joe, reporting a fire in the dumpster. Joe rushes to put it out but finds Michael's cell empty. Guy explains he was outside on the phone when someone broke in and helped Micheal escape. They split up to search. Joe eventually gets a call from Guy claiming he has found Micheal. When Joe arrives, he sees Micheal standing near a burning barrel. Smelling gasoline, a panicked Micheal warns that the area is rigged. The bomb explodes, killing Guy and wounding Joe. Despite his injuries, Joe spots someone recording the chaos. He shoots the masked man, then searches his phone, discovering he belongs to Antifa. At home, Joe sees a taxi outside. Inside, he thinks he sees his wife, but it's only a hallucination. It is Dawn. She tells him the Real killers are Vernon and Louise. Joe admits he is the one responsible. Suddenly, a gunshot is fired. Joe saves Dawn and flees as a masked man chases him. Meanwhile, Brian spots Joe running across a hill. Joe enters a gun shop and fires wildly into the street, accidentally shooting the detective, who is then killed by the masked man. Out of bullets, Joe is struck, but Brian emerges from behind a car and kills the attacker, saving Joe's life. 1 year later, Brian is celebrated as a local hero and builds a successful political career. Joe, though left in a vegetative state, still becomes mayor. Micheal is cleared of all charges and takes over as sheriff after it is confirmed Antifa was behind the attacks. Dawn becomes Joe's partner and opens the data center he once opposed. At Joe's new home, he is cared for with little concern. That night, Dawn reveals that Louise is pregnant with Vernon's child. After putting Joe to bed, she lies beside him, then begins making out with the caretaker. The Eddington movie shows how unchecked ambition and lies can corrupt even those meant to protect a community. It warns that when truth is twisted for power, everyone, innocent or guilty, ends up paying the price.